The night air was thick, as though something heavy was pressing down on it, something I couldn't quite grasp. My hand gripped the cold metal of the car door as I tried to steady myself. She was shaking, her voice cracking. The street around us was eerily silent. "We need to leave now," she said, her eyes flicking back and forth between me and the dimly lit house behind us. I stared at her, my heart pounding, struggling to process the weight of her words. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a command. The urgency in her voice sliced through the quiet, leaving no room for doubt. Something was seriously wrong. "Why? What's happening?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was expecting to hear. She didn't answer, but instead opened the driver's door. Her hands trembled so much that it took her 2 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and she met my gaze again, her eyes brimming with something I couldn't recognize. Fear, but not the startled kind. It was something deeper, something raw. It made my stomach tighten. "Get in the car," she said, her tone sharper now. I hesitated for a moment, just long enough to catch a glimpse of her reflection in the side mirror. She looked different. The calm, composed woman I'd known for so long was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Someone who seemed to be fleeing from something or someone. I opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, unsure if I was making the right choice, but feeling like there was no other option. The car lurched forward, speeding down the quiet street. I glanced back at the house, and everything looked normal. Too normal. No flashing lights, no signs of trouble. Yet, the knot in my stomach tightened even more. "What are we running from?" I whispered, the tension in the car palpable. She didn't answer immediately. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened until her knuckles turned white, and her breaths were shallow, as if she was desperately trying to hold herself together. "I can't explain everything right now," she finally said, her voice trembling. "You just need to trust me. We're not safe." I wanted to ask more questions, to demand answers, but something in the way she spoke stopped me. This wasn't the time. Not yet. I turned to look out the window, watching the city lights blur past, trying to make sense of it all. But it felt like trying to solve a puzzle with pieces missing. Nothing added up. Minutes ticked by in silence, only broken by the soft hum of the tires on the road. My mind raced with 100 questions, none of which made any sense. Why were we leaving? Who or what were we running from? I stole another glance at her, trying to read her face, but she kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Without warning, she swerved the car to the side of the road. The sudden stop jolted me forward in my seat, and I looked at her in confusion. "Why are we stopping?" Her hand trembled as she reached for the gear shift, her breath coming in short, quick gasps. She didn't meet my eyes. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her jaw tight with tension. "I need to tell you something," she whispered, barely audible, as if saying it out loud would make it too real. A chill ran down my spine, the kind that hits when you know something bad is about to happen. What's going on?" My voice sounded smaller than I meant it to, uncertain. She turned to face me, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. She was trying to hold it together but failing. "I've been hiding something from you. Something big." Her voice broke on the last word, and for a moment, I thought she might break down completely. But she didn't. She swallowed hard, straightening her shoulders as if bracing for what came next. I sat frozen, every muscle in my body tight with anticipation. She opened her mouth to speak, but something changed. Her expression softened, and before I could react, she leaned toward me. Her lips brushed mine, soft but unsure, yet filled with a sense of urgency that left me breathless. My heart slammed in my chest, and for a split second, I was paralyzed. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. All the confusion, all the fear, melted away in that one fleeting moment. It wasn't the kiss itself that caught me off guard. It was everything. It meant everything. It was as though everything shattered in that instant. She pulled back quickly, her breath ragged and uneven. The silence that followed was deafening. We sat there, motionless, neither of us able or willing to speak. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came. I was drowning in a storm of emotions. Shock, confusion, and something else I couldn't name. The air between us was thick with tension, as though we were teetering on the edge of something dangerous. "I'm sorry," she whispered, so quietly that I almost didn't hear it. Just as the words sank in, the buzz of her phone cut through the silence. She jumped, fumbling for the phone in her bag. I watched her glance at the screen, her face draining of color. "We have to go," she said, her voice barely holding together. Before I could ask what was going on, she slammed the car into gear, and we were speeding down the road again. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing made sense. The car hummed along the narrow road, and soon the city lights were a distant memory. All that remained were the headlights cutting through the trees, casting long shadows on either side. I stared out the window, still trying to process everything. The kiss, her words, the fear that lingered in the air between us. "Where are we going?" I finally asked, breaking the heavy silence. My voice sounded distant, like it wasn't even mine. "To the lake house," she replied, her voice tight, still thick with tension. "We'll be safe there." I didn't understand. Safe from what? From who? I wanted to press her for more answers, but something told me she wasn't ready to explain. Not yet. I turned back to the window, watching as the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The road ahead was dark, winding, and unfamiliar. After what felt like hours, the car slowed as we approached a small wooden gate. It creaked as she pushed it open, and we drove down a dirt path lined with overgrown bushes. The lake house finally appeared, barely visible against the faint light. It was smaller than I had expected. More of a cabin, really hidden deep in the woods, far removed from everything. She killed the engine, and for a moment we sat there in silence. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the distant croaking of frogs from the lake. I glanced at her, but her eyes were locked on the house ahead. Her jaw tightened as if she was preparing for something. "You've been here before?" I asked, more as a statement than a question. The way she stared at the house, it was obvious she knew this place well. "Yes," she replied quietly. "It used to belong to my parents. They brought me here when I was a kid." I waited, expecting her to elaborate, but she didn't. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out, leaving me to sit with my thoughts. I followed her inside, the dry leaves crunching beneath my feet and the damp night air sticking to my skin. Inside, the house smelled musty, like old wood and dust. The air was stale, as if it hadn't been opened in ages. The furniture was old, worn from years of use, but still carefully arranged, as though someone had just stepped away. I ran my fingers along the back of the couch, dust collecting under my touch. She disappeared into a back room, and I took the chance to wander. The house felt strange, like it was frozen in time, holding its breath until we arrived. It was quiet, unnervingly so, as though we were the only people left in the world. I found myself drawn to a large window facing the lake. The surface was nearly invisible under the moon's dim light. The water was unnaturally still, like glass, reflecting the trees across the shore. Their shadows stretched out in jagged lines. I didn't know what we were running from, but being here, in this isolation, gave me an uneasy feeling. Felt like we were trapped. I heard her footsteps behind me and turned to see her standing in the doorway, her face unreadable. She had changed into a worn sweater, one that looked like it belonged to someone else. "You should get some rest," she said softly, almost apologetically. "It's been a long night." I wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but the weight of exhaustion hit me like a wall. My body felt heavy, my thoughts foggy as though the adrenaline had finally worn off. I nodded, and she led me down the hallway to a small room at the end. It was simple, just a bed and a small dresser, but it felt like a safe place. She paused at the door, lingering as if she had more to say, but the words never came. Instead, she gave me a tight smile before disappearing down the hall, leaving me alone in the quiet once more. I lay down, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything that had happened in the last few hours. I thought about the kiss, the way it had felt, It wasn't just the kiss, it was everything. It had felt desperate, like she was reaching for something she couldn't have. I turned over and pulled the blanket tighter around me, but sleep didn't come. My mind kept circling back to her, to the fear in her eyes, to the questions that had built up without answers. What were we hiding from? And why did it feel like this was just the beginning of something bigger, something darker? A soft sound broke my thoughts. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hall. I sat up, straining to listen. She had said we'd be safe here, but the more I listened, the more unsure I became. I slipped out of bed and quietly padded to the door, peeking out into the hall. The lights were off, but the moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The footsteps came again, closer now, and my heart started to race. I moved down the hall, careful not to make a sound. When I reached the living room, I saw her standing by the window, her face lit by the pale light as she stared out at the lake. She didn't turn when I approached, didn't seem to notice I was there. "What's going on?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't respond at first. Then, without looking at me, she said, "We're not safe here." "Not really." The air between us crackled with tension, taut like a wire ready to snap. The days that followed felt endless. We fell into an odd routine of avoidance. She spent most of her time walking around the house, checking the doors and windows as if she were expecting something bad to happen. I pretended everything was fine, even though I knew deep down it wasn't. The house, too, seemed to reflect our unease. It was too quiet, eerily quiet, and the silence felt suffocating, as though it was closing in around us. I found myself constantly listening for any sound, any clue as to why we were hiding here. But all I heard was the creak of the old wooden floors and the wind whispering through the trees outside. One afternoon, I wandered into the kitchen, hoping to find some distraction. She was already there, standing by the counter, staring out the small window that looked over the backyard. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee, but she wasn't drinking it. The air between us was thick with things unsaid, building up over the past few days. I stood in the doorway watching her. She looked worn out, not just tired, but drained, like she was carrying the weight of everything. Her eyes, usually so sharp and focused, were dull and distant. She hadn't been sleeping well. Neither had I. "I don't understand why we're still here," I finally said, breaking the silence. She didn't turn to face me, but I saw her grip tighten around the cup. "We're here because it's necessary," she said, her voice low, almost strained. "That's not good enough," I shot back, stepping fully into the room. "You keep saying we're not safe, but you won't explain why. What's really happening?" This time, she turned to face me, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt different. For the first time since we arrived, it was as if she was actually seeing me. I caught a fleeting glimpse of doubt in her expression, but it vanished almost instantly, replaced by that unshakable mask of control she had perfected. "You have to trust me," she said, her voice steady, even stern. "I'm doing this for your protection." I couldn't contain my frustration. I shook my head, my voice rising. "Protect me from what? You keep saying we're in danger, but all I see is nothing. There's no threat here. We're hiding in this house, completely isolated." The words spilled out, the weight of her silence crushing me. "I'm starting to think you're not telling me everything. You're keeping things from me." She sighed heavily, setting her cup on the counter, her posture slumping in defeat. For a split second, I thought she might finally tell me everything, but then she just looked at me, her face filled with exhaustion and resignation. "You don't need to know everything," she murmured. "There are some things it's better you don't know." That was it, the final straw. I couldn't take the half-truths anymore, the evasions, the way she closed herself off. I took a step forward, my voice escalating. "I'm not a kid. I deserve to know what's going on. If we're in danger, if something's coming for us, I have the right to understand what we're facing." Her eyes flashed with something, anger, fear, before narrowing into a steely resolve. But she didn't flinch. "You think you're ready for the truth? You're not." I met her gaze without hesitation. Try me. For a long moment, the air was thick with unspoken words, both of us bracing for what would come next. Then, without another word, she shoved past me and headed for the door. I followed her, the screen door slamming shut behind us. The air outside was thick, heavy with humidity. The sky was dull and gray, the kind of oppressive clouds that seemed to weigh everything down. The lake, usually calm, looked disturbed today. Its surface churned with the wind, unsettlingly dark. She walked down the narrow path leading to the dock, her pace swift and purposeful. I hurried after her, my heart thumping in my chest. When she reached the edge of the dock, she stopped and stared at the water. I approached but didn't say anything. We stood there, side by side, as the wind whipped at her hair, her back to me. For a moment, I thought she might step into the water, letting it swallow her whole, leaving this mess behind. "I'm not who you think I am," she finally spoke, her voice barely rising above the lapping waves. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning I didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" I asked, confused. She turned slowly to face me, her expression raw, more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. "There are things about my past," she began, her voice shaking, "things I haven't told you. Things that could hurt you if you knew." I froze, everything in me bracing for whatever was coming next. This was it, the truth, or at least part of it. "Then tell me," I urged, stepping closer. "I can handle it. I need to know." She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's not that simple. If I tell you, everything will change. You won't look at me the same way. You'll hate me." My heart clenched at her words, and I reached for her arm, gently pulling her toward me. "I won't hate you," I promised. "I'll never hate you." She gave a bitter laugh, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You don't know that. You can't promise that." I fell silent, unsure of what to say. How could I assure her when I wasn't even sure of myself? "I made mistakes," she continued, her voice trembling. "I did things I'm ashamed of. And now those things are catching up with me. With us." The weight of her confession hit me like a blow to the chest. I had known there were parts of her life she never talked about, but I never imagined it was anything like this. "What kind of mistakes?" I asked, my voice quiet but insistent. She hesitated, her gaze flicking away from mine. Then, after a long moment, she exhaled slowly, her words barely above a whisper. "I got involved with people, bad people, people who don't forgive. And now they're looking for me." A cold chill ran through me, and I realized that the danger we were hiding from wasn't just some vague threat. It was real, and it could find us at any moment. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I demanded, my frustration boiling over. "I didn't want you to worry," she said softly, her voice tinged with regret. "I thought I could keep you safe. Thought I could handle it." She paused, her expression pained. But I was wrong. My mind spun, trying to process everything. She had just revealed so much, and yet it felt like the tip of the iceberg. We weren't just hiding, we were being hunted. Before I could find the words to respond, she turned away and walked back toward the house, leaving me standing there, still trying to comprehend what she had just told me. I stood on the dock, staring at the dark water, my thoughts a swirling mix of confusion, anger, and fear. I had wanted the truth, but now that I had it, I wasn't sure I was ready for what came next. The following days felt like a blur. The house, which had once seemed like a refuge, now felt like a prison. The walls closed in around us, and the woods outside felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. I had hoped that after she confessed, things would become clearer, but instead they became even murkier. She was different now, distant, withdrawn. It was as if telling me the truth had created an insurmountable distance between us. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't reach her. She spent hours by the window, staring at the lake, lost in thought. Sometimes she muttered things like, "They're coming," or "It's only a matter of time." But when I pressed her for details, she'd just shake her head, refusing to say more. I tried to distract myself, but the silence in the house was suffocating. Every creak of the old floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, sent my heart racing. We couldn't stay here forever. We were just waiting. For what? I didn't know. The uncertainty was driving me mad. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront her. I found her in the kitchen, her back to me as she washed dishes, the sound of running water filling the room. But it did nothing to ease the tension between us. "We can't stay here like this," I said, my voice coming out more forcefully than I expected. She didn't even glance at me, continuing to scrub a plate with slow, mechanical movements. The steady clink of the plate against the drying rack was the only sound in the room. "I'm serious," I pressed, stepping closer. "We need to make a plan. We can't just wait for them to find us." She remained silent. It was as if I hadn't spoken at all. The frustration inside me began to boil over. Why was she acting like this? After everything. After all the truth she had revealed. Why was she still shutting me out? "Talk to me," I said, my voice rising, more desperate than I intended. "You owe me that much." Finally, she turned around, her eyes locking onto mine. The look in her eyes stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was resignation. "There's nothing more to say," she replied softly. "I told you what you needed to know. Now we just wait." "Wait for what?" I threw my hands up in frustration. "For them to come and find us? For something terrible to happen? This isn't a plan. It's suicide." Her eyes narrowed, and I caught a flash of something. Guilt, maybe, but it was gone in an instant. She turned away again, her gaze drifting to the window where the last traces of daylight were fading behind the trees. "We can't outrun them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No matter where we go, they'll find us. It's better if we stay here." I stared at her, my disbelief growing. "So what? We just sit here and wait for them to show up? That's your plan?" She didn't answer, and the silence between us grew heavier, suffocating. I felt like I was losing her, like the person I thought I knew was slipping further and further away. I turned away, pacing the kitchen, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to find a way out of this nightmare. But she was so certain, so determined to stay. I didn't know what to do. "Why won't you fight back?" I asked, my voice trembling with frustration. "You can't just give up." For a brief moment, her expression softened. She looked at me and I saw a flicker of something, vulnerability maybe. "I'm not giving up," she said quietly. "I'm protecting you." Her words hit me harder than I expected. In that moment, I saw the woman I once knew, before all the secrets, before the danger. She wasn't acting out of fear. She was doing this because she believed it was the only way to keep me safe. But I couldn't accept that. Not anymore. "Then let me help you," I said, stepping closer to her. "We can figure this out together. We don't have to just wait here for them to find us. There has to be another way." She shook her head, her gaze drifting back to the window, her eyes distant. "You don't understand," she whispered. "There is no other way. They've been after me for years. They don't forget. They don't stop. No matter where we go, they'll find us." "Then we fight," I said, my resolve hardening. "We don't just sit here and wait for them to win." She was silent for a long moment. The light in the kitchen was dimming now, and I watched her, waiting for her response. But when she finally spoke, her words sent a chill through my whole body. "It's already too late," she whispered. A shiver ran down my spine. The way she said it, the finality in her voice, it felt like a death sentence. I stepped closer to her, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She didn't look at me, her gaze fixed on something far away, something I couldn't see. "I thought I could protect you," she said softly. "I thought I could keep you safe. But they're already here." Her words hung in the air, and I didn't fully understand what she meant until I heard it. The faint sound of tires crunching over gravel. My heart stopped. I turned toward the window, my pulse racing. Through the darkening gloom, I saw headlights creeping down the dirt road toward the house. Panic gripped me like a vice. "We have to go," I said, grabbing her arm. "We need to leave now." But she didn't move. She just stood there, her eyes locked on the approaching car. Her expression was unreadable. It's too late, she said, her voice calm, almost serene. There's nowhere left to run. I looked at her in disbelief. How could she be so calm? How could she just stand there, accepting whatever was about to happen? Come on, I urged, my voice frantic. We can still get out of here. But deep down, I knew she was right. There was nowhere left to go. The car came to a stop at the end of the driveway, and I watched, horrified, as the doors slowly opened. Figures emerged from the vehicle, their faces hidden in shadow. But I didn't need to see them to know who they were. They had found us. The figures began to move toward the house, their steps slow, deliberate. My heart was racing as I grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away from the window, but she didn't budge. It was as though she had already surrendered. Please, I whispered, my voice breaking. We need to go now. She didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the figures outside, her body rigid, like stone. I shook her arm again, harder this time, trying to break her out of whatever trance she was in. Snap out of it, I hissed, my voice rising with panic. We can still run. We can still— No, she interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. There's no running anymore. It's over. I stared at her, stunned. How could she be so resigned? How could she just give up like this? But then I saw it in her eyes, the absence of fear, the absence of regret. It wasn't even sadness. It was acceptance. She had made her decision. What do you mean it's over? I demanded, panic rising in my throat. We can fight this. We don't have to give up. She turned to face me, her gaze softening when our eyes met. I've been running from this for so long, she murmured, her voice quiet, almost regretful. And I'm exhausted.
So exhausted.
I thought I could keep you safe, but all I've done is pull you deeper into this mess. Her words hit me harder than I expected, each one like a weight pressing on my chest. I didn't know what to feel or how to respond. All I could think was that the person standing in front of me was no longer the woman I'd known. She was a stranger, someone who'd been hiding something so overwhelming that it had changed everything between us. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the fear that was rising inside me. We don't have to do this, I said, my voice faltering. We can still leave. We can run, find somewhere they can't reach us. But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. We couldn't escape this. It had already caught up with us, and no matter how far we went, it would find us. She knew it, and I could see that in her eyes. The sound of footsteps outside grew louder, more distinct. Boots crunching on gravel, low voices murmuring. My heart was pounding in my chest, my instincts screaming for us to flee, to get away from whatever was coming. But I couldn't leave her. Not like this. She took a deep, steadying breath, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of everything was too much to bear. I never wanted this for you, she whispered, so softly it was almost lost to the wind. I tried so hard to protect you, but all I've done is make everything worse. Her words struck me in a way I didn't expect. You didn't have to do this alone, I said, trying to keep the trembling out of my voice. You should have told me. I would have helped. She shook her head slowly, a sad, knowing smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Some things you can't help with. Some things, it's better if you don't know. Her words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken truth I could barely grasp. I wanted to argue, to tell her that I wasn't afraid, that I could handle whatever this was. But I couldn't find the words. The truth was, I didn't even know what we were facing, let alone how to fight it. The sound of the front door creaking open pulled me back to the present. My breath caught, the world narrowing to the sound of footsteps moving deliberately through the house. They were inside now. I could hear them moving, taking their time, knowing they had us cornered. She stepped in front of me, her body tense, blocking my view of the doorway. Stay behind me, she murmured, her voice barely audible. I wanted to protest, to tell her I wasn't some helpless bystander, but my body wouldn't move. Fear had rooted me to the spot. I stood there, helpless, as the first figure appeared in the doorway. His face was hidden in shadows, his presence cold and silent. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching us, his gaze unsettlingly calm. She didn't flinch. You found us? She asked, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. Now what? The figure took a step forward, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. You know what happens next, he said in a low, measured tone, and it was like the air itself shifted, the gravity of the situation pressing down on me. My chest tightened. The moment was slipping away, and I could feel everything we feared closing in. But then, in a move that stunned me, she stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the figure. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice steady, almost eerily calm. "But leave him out of this." My heart stopped. "What are you doing?" The words barely left my mouth before the figure responded. "That's not how this works," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. For a brief second, she looked at me. Just a flicker, but enough for me to see what she wasn't saying. She wasn't surrendering to her fate. She was trying to protect me. This was her way of making sure I wouldn't be dragged into whatever this was. She was taking the fall for both of us. "No," I said, desperation rising in my throat. "I'm not letting you do this." Her gaze softened, her eyes filled with something I couldn't name. Sorrow? Maybe, or resignation. "It's the only way," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I wanted to scream at her to stop, to tell her that there had to be another choice, but the words choked in my throat. She turned back to the figure, her resolve unshaken. And then, before I even had a chance to react, she kissed me. It wasn't like the first time. This kiss was different, soft, final, as though she was saying goodbye. And when she pulled away, her eyes held mine for a moment, long enough for me to see everything. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the figure, surrendering herself to whatever was waiting outside. The figure grabbed her arm, and I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to stop it, unable to move. As they reached the door, she turned back once more, her eyes meeting mine. Then she was gone. The silence in the house was suffocating. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on me. I stood frozen, staring at the empty doorway, my mind whirling. My heart shattered in my chest. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that she was gone, or the fact that I would never understand why.